Hello and good morning to all of you. I'm honored to host the first AmCham Coffee to Connect in 2021. At the beginning, I would like to wish all of you healthy, peaceful, and mostly a predictable year. So, 2 months have passed since the US elections, and we are 5 days away from the inauguration of the new president, Joe Biden. And I'm sure nobody expected the attack that happened on the Capitol the recent week. So the guest of today's discussion is Steve Staresinicem. We know Steve for quite a while, and we already have him as a guest speaker in November. Steve is an American chartered accountant with Slovenian roots who lives in Germany. Hello, Steve, and welcome, and of course, a very happy and healthy new year.
Živio vida in živio dragi AmCham skumnosti uže dobro novo leto.
Oh, very nice, Steve. You are practicing Slovene, I see. So before we start, you can place your questions into the Q&A section, and of course, we'll try to answer them during the discussion. If not, you can also send your questions to my email, and Steve will try to answer them through email. So, Steve, we know each other for many years now, and if you allow me, I would raise the first question, which will be a kind of personal. So how it feels to be an American these days?
Well, as always, I am proud and grateful to be the citizen of a great nation, which has provided a lot of opportunity and prosperity to me and millions of other people. Of course, here I will use as an example my and our Slovenian ancestors who were immigrants to the United States. And of course, this nation too has a lot of power and has a lot of responsibility, both the individual citizens and the government, the state. And I do not expect, just like all other business people, do not expect or even want the government to be involved in every aspect of business and life and to try to provide a solution for every problem. There's an important role for government, and we are very disappointed. We are very disappointed and concerned when the government is not acting in a spirit of cooperation, of fairness, of consideration for everybody's values and opinions. And I believe that that was the case. And there were a lot of participants in the process, not just the outgoing president of the United States, who have not been working to foster a healthy democratic environment. So that's something that we are disappointed in, are concerned about, and we criticize, and it has to improve.
We all know United States are the country of freedom and the democracy. Do you think democracy now is on trial in the United States?
Democracy is always on trial. Democracy is always under and subject to many challenges because it has to take into consideration and weigh all sorts of viewpoints, all sorts of rights, all sorts of entitlements that people believe they have to have, especially with a large and heterogeneous population like the United States. Here, I would like to remind us of the very wise words of Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was one of the architects of the US Constitution, which we'll talk about many times in our webinar, and he was the third president of the United States. He wrote back in 1787, when they were drafting the Constitution, the price of freedom, the burden of democracy is eternal vigilance. Eternal vigilance. That means we always have to be working together. We always have to be cooperating. We always have to be on guard and deal with those who oppose fairness, oppose justice, oppose rights. And I can repeat here, I and many Americans believe that a lot of participants in the political process, including the president, the outgoing president of the United States, and some of his most extreme supporters, and some people who are simply strongly against the incoming administration, have crossed the line and have completely violated all of the traditions and all of the principles of democracy. The great majority of the population, the great majority, of course, is strongly opposed to that, strongly against all of those. And we have to do everything we can, not just the government, but every person, every household, every school, to maintain, upkeep, remind people of the traditions of democracy: fairness, consideration for others, consideration of rights, and tolerance. And all of those things were strongly violated on the 6th of January. It was more than just the attack on a building. However, and I think we have to keep this in mind from the very beginning, democracy is also very strong. The process, which we'll describe in a little bit more detail shortly, functioned as it was supposed to function. The process that was taking place on January 6th was only delayed by a few hours, and there was never any doubt, not even for a moment, that what was supposed to happen, the approval or the confirmation of the results of the Electoral College from December 5th was going to take place. Mm-hmm. So democracy is much stronger than people think it is. And I would even add one last thing to this point here. The extremist who invaded the building and vandalized the Capitol building certainly didn't accomplish anything. And what they did was, to me, as you know, one of my strongest points of criticism is to say something is counterproductive. It worked against what you were trying to do. All of these people did was to bring condemnation against them, and they were also very stupid, very foolish. Many of them put themselves on social media, and the FBI and other law enforcement authorities are going around arresting all these people. As you know very well, and our businesses know very well, it's not a good idea to fight against the US government. They're very strong. 1,000 rioters are not going to bring them to their knees. There are going to be people who invaded the Capitol and broke windows who will go to prison, be sentenced to go to a federal prison for 20 years, 30 years. They're going to be very sorry that they did that. Look what happened to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. Totally different stories, but it's the same. And there are other examples of this principle. If you fight against the US state, the big state, you will see how strong they are. And I strongly advise businesses, don't work against the state. You have to follow the regulations. You have to, and I help you to do that, of course.
And definitely, democracy requires mature and responsible people.
Yes.
But we are not political analysts. Right. We will, of course, get back to those events that happened and are still in the process. I need to say a few words about you, Steve. What is your background and what you do? So Steve is helping Slovenian and other European companies enter the US market and comply with US regulations. Because Steve, you are saying in order to understand regulations, you need to understand the government.
Yes.
So today we'll talk about the government, the regulations, recent events, and of course, how these affect the business, because we are the business community. So, Steve, you consult many European and also Slovenian companies. How do they perceive these events that happen? How do they perceive the situation in the state?
They would be good examples of the majority of Americans that I mentioned earlier, who are certainly opposed to any form of violence. And this is very important, opposed to any destruction of property. One of the hallmarks of the free market economy is the sanctity and protection of property and of rights. And anytime those are violated, the business community and individual business people oppose those things and would never support people who are involved or support action like that. That's a very important thing. The business community and business people are concerned that there is very little cooperation among the two parties, that this is another problem, that the source of some of the legitimate complaints of the Trump supporters or the people who were opposing the events of January 6th is that there was a lot of sloppiness and error in many states in the election process. And as I mentioned in our webinar in November, that is not untypical for a lot of government work and government functioning in the US. It is not as efficient as it should be. For that example, if there's a mail-in ballot, there should be one way that that is administered and that is processed, not 7 or 8 different ways. And somebody decides we'll do it one of the ways instead of the one way you're supposed to do that. Business people realize that, and they're always opposed to that. And the last part of this would be the business community realizes that this transition from the one president to the next president is going to take place not as harmoniously as it was in the past. Businesses in the markets always look forward, are always looking forward. And the financial markets use the term, they've already priced in things that they anticipate going to happen. And a lot of businesses are anticipating the different environment that you might have under the Biden administration. And they're much more concerned about that than the events taking place in Washington, which pretty much are going to proceed as foreseen in the Constitution.
Since you mentioned the financial markets, I will ask this question now. The American economy is doing quite great, so the financial markets are going up. This is a good news in these times. What is your comment?
Yes, well, at one level, of course, that is a good thing. There's several reasons for that, and I'll cover one or two of those reasons in my view. For one thing, most American businesses have not perceived the election process nor even the corona situation as a crisis. They've perceived it as very serious challenge that has to be overcome, and businesses are always overcoming challenges, and these were just extra ones. So a lot of businesses are more flexible now. They're more efficient because they have been forced to become more efficient. That's a very good thing. Another reason why the financial markets are at one level doing so well is, of course, there has been a lot of stimulus. There's been a lot of financial resources, a lot of money has been pumped into the financial system, which is good in the short run. And that's why you see all the prices going up, the share prices going up, a lot of the indexes going up. That's why you see Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies going up, and the gold as a reaction against that, because we're looking also at the longer term effects. There has to be long-term inflationary tendencies when so many resources are, so to speak, artificially being created and pumped into the financial system. And of course, all the deficit spending. Biden's administration just announced, I think yesterday, its intentions of, and this was not unexpected, of adding close to 2 trillion, and it's hard to grasp if you write out all the zeros how much that is, 2 trillion more stimulus into the financial system. Once again, short term, maybe a good thing, long term, inflationary. Last point there is more stimulus, more resources, more money, liquidity being added into the financial system causes an imbalance between the large corporations, large institutions, and smaller businesses and individual people, because as we all know, a a lot of those resources don't trickle down, do not reach small businesses and individual people as the Keynesian theory says it should. It never does. So there's good and bad to all of those developments, which are going to continue more so under the Biden administration than they even would under the Allen administration, I think.
If you are a business person and you are the owner of the company, you need to understand the regulation in the states. Yeah. But before that, you need to understand how the government is functioning in the states. So would you please comment? And we have some slides that you prepared. So Brina, can you please share the first slide? And you can also, Steve, explain why is it good or bad that the same party is having also the legislative and executive power.
Okay, this first slide is sort of a repeat of the subject we covered in our webinar on 20 November, and it's very familiar to U.S. citizens who learned U.S. civics in school, and it's very familiar to a lot of people in our European audience who are well informed about politics. The U.S. government is designed by the U.S. Constitution to be limited, not to be very powerful, even though it has become very powerful. There are various measures built into the U.S. federal government to restrict its power. And one of them is the structure of the three branches, separate branches, legislative on the left side, which consists of the Congress, the two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the executive branch, which is represented by the President of the United States, the Vice President, and the Cabinet, which carries out the laws, and the judicial branch, the court system, which interprets laws and makes an assessment as to whether they are constitutional or not, whether they are allowed to be laws. The legislative branch has two houses. The Senate has 100 members, 2 members for each state. Each state is represented as equally so that the states with a larger population cannot exercise more power over the smaller states. The House of Representatives has 435 members, and there is more representation. There's representation based on the size of the population. So California, New York, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania have more representatives than the states with a smaller population. In order for a bill, a suggestion for a law to become a law, both of those houses, the Senate and House of Representatives, have to approve it, have to pass the law, and then it goes on to the president to be signed. And this idea about, usually in American history, the executive branch is represented by a different party than the majority in the legislative. And most of the time in American history, the Senate and the House of Representatives have had a majority of different parties. And that means that the checks and balances is functioning more strongly, and it's harder to pass laws. And the logic in the tradition of the United States is the harder it is to pass a law, the better, because then the government will not become too powerful. So what we see now is, and these were the results of the election on January the 5th in Georgia, is now the Senate is even 50%, 50-50, and the House of Representatives has a small Democratic majority. So that means it will still be difficult to pass a lot of legislation, and the president will then tend, since the president is a Democrat, will tend not to veto the legislation. Next slide, please. Once again, this is a slide which is a brief description of the checks and balances, the measures and countermeasures that each branch can take against the other branch. And this is all written in the U.S. Constitution from 1787. Basically, we just mentioned two of the most important ones. Congress, the two houses, pass laws. The president can veto a law. The president can say, I am not going to allow this law to go into effect and to be executed, to be carried out. Then that law goes back to the Congress, and then it has to be passed by a 2/3 majority and not a simple majority of 50% or 51%. Even given the fact that the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives and it's a tie in the Senate, it is virtually impossible to get a 2/3 majority. So the checks and balances are functioning very strongly here. One other thing to highlight is the executive branch, the president, President Biden, the oncoming president, nominates all sorts of federal office holders. For instance, the members of his cabinet, the heads and the leaders of all of these many regulatory agencies, such as the Food and Drug Administration, which a lot of our Slovenian companies that we work with have to deal with, among others. And of course, for instance, all of the ambassadors to all of the various countries. The executive branch nominates those people, but they have to be approved by the Senate. And that means the Senate can say, we do not believe that this person is the right person, and we are not going to allow the nomination. That will likely happen to perhaps one or two of the cabinet nominations that Biden has made. And it will also happen to some of the leaders of the regulatory agencies and maybe some ambassadors as well. Next slide, please. This is just to give people an overview, because this is a very long process, the US election. The popular election took place back on 3rd November. That was the evening we had our election night function at AmCham. And it took a while for the results to come in, because once of all these reasons, and particularly that there were so many ballot absentee things that had to be counted for weeks and disputed for weeks. But the incoming President Biden was elected by the delegates to the Electoral College conducted in every individual state. That took place on 14 December 2020. And the results were Biden ended up receiving 306 electors, and Trump ended up receiving 232. You need 270 to win. So Biden was the clear winner. And even though in many states there has been many cases, much evidence of mistakes, errors, sloppiness, regulations that the state put in, which are probably against the US Constitution, there really is not enough to challenge these results that Biden received the great majority of electors, much more than 270, and then won the election. Each state certified that electoral vote, and then, and this is foreseen in the Constitution, in the first week of the following year, the joint session of Congress, Senate, and the House of Representatives counted and certified those electoral results. And that's the reason why those people assembled to demonstrate on 6th January. They were thinking, let's do something to at least oppose or protest this process. And then a few of the agitators, or about 1,000, decided, let's go in and try to physically stop them from doing it. And they did delay them by several hours, but it ended up taking place as was meant to be. And that means the way is now open for the next President Biden to be inaugurated, that is put into office, and that will happen at noontime next Wednesday, 20 January 2021. Next slide, please. This is the way the Congress will actually look. The session that started already on 3 January, 12 days ago, almost 2 weeks ago. The Senate has 100 members, and there's 50 Republicans and there's 50 Democrats. The US Constitution put in a tiebreaker, and the tiebreaker is the Vice President of the United States. Who's the Vice President of the United States? It will be, starting 20 January at noontime, Kamala Harris, who of course is a Democrat. And she will, when it's 50-50, of course, we would expect her to vote on yes on votes that were introduced by members of her party. I believe, though, that it will not very often happen that will be 50 to 50. And the reason for that is the United States, it took us 150 years to get down to two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. We used to have 3, 4, 5 parties, like in many European countries. It finally settled for about the past 100 years down to the two parties. And when you only have two parties, in each party, there's a wide variety of views and political attitudes and tendencies that the individual Congress people have. In each party, in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, there are 5 to 10 members in general, 2 or 3 or 4 from each party, who you never can predict how they're going to vote. They're very open-minded. They will not just vote for a Democratic suggested bill or law because they happen to be members of the Democratic Party. They won't do that. So it will be very challenging. It always is. Anytime you introduce a future law in the United States, if you're a Republican, you have to find members of the other party who will support you. And the same thing with the Democrats. So it will not be like everything will just fly through the House of Representatives and the Senate, and President Biden will approve it. It will not be that easy for the legislature, for Congress, or for President Biden. As you see, the House of Representatives has a small majority of the Democrats, and that it was much larger in the past administration. It was reduced. The Democrats lost a number of seats on the 3rd of November. And what always happens, this is something we have to keep in mind also, is that there are elections every 2 years for every member of the House of Representatives. So that means all 435 have to be elected again less than 2 years from now. And what almost always happens in every presidential administration is the opposing party gains a lot of seats in both the House of Representatives and sometimes also in the Senate in that 2 years after the new president takes power, the midterm elections, and that makes his job, the job for his administration, much, much more difficult, much more strict checks and balances, much harder to get legislation through, much harder to pass law, much limiting on the government. And I expect that to happen this time also. Next slide, please.
Oh, this is my slide.
Yes.
Okay, I was planning to more focus on the new government, but we can go back and focus on the recent event, the attack on the Capitol. So what are the consequences, basically, of this demonstration and the attack of the House of the People?
As mentioned, there's a lot of opposition to it. As mentioned, 99% of the population of the United States disapprove of that, disapprove of those actions. Of course, those actions didn't accomplish anything. They were bad. They shouldn't have happened, but it didn't accomplish anything. And of course, the people who were involved in that are subject now to very strict and strong and draconian sanctions and punishments. So it just didn't really make much sense even in that aspect for them to have done that. The U.S. Capitol has been attacked numerous times in the history of the United States, and there were 2 times in the 20th century in which explosive devices actually detonated in the Capitol, and one time in the year 1954 was at a time when Congress was in session. They were actually meeting, much like they were doing in January 6th, and nobody was seriously injured. And of course, we have to keep this in perspective also. This was not a totally, because of those examples also, this was not a totally unique situation, and the level of size and intensity of the demonstration was very modest compared to a lot of demonstrations that were done in the past. For instance, I will mention this, I remember this, and a lot of Americans who are older than me will remember this. During the Vietnam War era, which was in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, there were enormous crowds of demonstrators, 100 times more than the ones who were assembled on January 6th, who demonstrated at the Capitol, on the Capitol steps, all over Washington, in every large city in the United States. It was very common during those days in cities of the United States for a government building to be attacked, set on fire, offices ransacked, papers thrown out the window by people who were opposing the Vietnam War. And those were much more extensive, much more universal than this particular action on January 6th was. But of course, once again, all of those actions where there is a violation of property, where there is violence, have to be condemned. That is no way to run government business. That's no way to run a democracy. So that has to be condemned. And that's what people have done.
And one of the consequences is also the permanent suspension of Donald Trump Twitter account. And we see on the last slide two tweets. And can you comment that permanent suspension? And also, yes. Facebook recently made some block of some accounts. Can you comment that? Is that a democracy?
No. In my opinion, no. It is not a good thing for freedom of speech to be limited, especially if it's done by somebody who wasn't even elected to an office. The corporation Twitter or Facebook or Google, nobody elected them to any office. Those are privately run corporations. And that's one problem. Another problem is they, in my opinion, my experience, are not very consistent or very consequential about whose access to social media they restrict or they don't restrict. Not to argue about the merits of the president's arguments, although I've stated very clearly, even in our last webinar, that there is no evidence that the election was stolen from him. There is no evidence that he actually won the election. So I think that is not a true statement. But in any event, that is a claim that he has made, which cannot be substantiated or evidenced. If you want to remove that or not allow that to be communicated in social media, there are a lot of other sites, there are a lot of other people, there are a lot of other accounts, a lot of other statements that also need to be restricted because they are also claims that can't be evidenced. So that's a bad precedent that freedom of expression is limited. It's also very bad that it's not done consistently by whoever's doing it. However, once again, there is also, I think, going to be some sort of free market reaction to this. I think it's potentially going to be the case that social media and other forms of media become like cable television did in the United States during the 1980s, and I think in the European countries more in the 1990s. All sorts of cable TV stations were created, all sorts of Facebooks and Twitters are going to be created potentially. And people who hold a certain opinion, belong to a certain party, belong to a certain intellectual community, will rotate or migrate to whichever media outlet fits them or serves their purposes. And that's in many respects healthy. So what could very well happen is there will be a strong competitor that arises to Twitter because all the people who opposed this action from Twitter or Facebook will have a strong tendency to take their usership somewhere else. Twitter may also very well have the problem that they lose a lot of their users or their members. Since the Trump administration started, they've increased their number of users by over 100%, and they're not all going to stay. And as we noticed, the capital markets have reacted against this. The shares of Twitter have dropped a lot since they took that action, because the markets realize in the long run, it's not good for Twitter. It's not good for the share price. It's probably not good for the society. And rivals, competitors will arise out of this. And that does have a good aspect to it.
Yeah. But let's now move to the new government, to what is important for European companies and also Slovenian companies that are on the US market. So can you give us, Steve, an outlook on Biden administration? I know you mentioned before, not everybody will be, accepted by the Senate. But what will be his, focus of the Biden government?
Okay, it seems very clear from Biden's statements about what he believes or what he's going to try to accomplish with his new administration, and by the nominations that he has made to his cabinet positions and to other key regulatory organizations. There's, number one, going to be a big emphasis, and we already mentioned this, on more stimulus. The government wants to get more liquidity into the hands of the economy, with the disadvantage that a lot of times it's that those resources remain stuck, so to speak, in large institutions in the financial markets, and never gets down to the broad part of the population. But that's very clear that that's going to continue. There's going to be a big emphasis on taking actions against perceived climate change and the so-called new green economy. And this has advantages and disadvantages, of course, for businesses. On one hand, there will be a lot more environmental regulations. There will be a lot more laws, a lot more prohibitions that businesses have to factor into their planning process. There will be materials, for instance, that they will no longer be able to use. They will likely have higher energy costs. They will have they will be forced to do more of a sort of a good thing, that is life cycle of a whole product. They have to make sure that they can dispose of the product in an environmentally friendly manner. Those all add costs, and they add on details to the production process, to the production cycle. So that's definitely going to happen. On the other hand, there's advantages to this too. There are many companies in the US, there are many companies that we know and work with in Slovenia who are very strong in green technology, and there will be more opportunities for those companies. And then the one thing that we have to always put as a caveat to that is that when the government spends funds on for a particular purpose, such as environmental protection or the green economy, they choose to a great extent to whom they're going to provide those funds. And anybody who knows economics, anybody who is active in business knows the government tends not to make very good investment decisions. That is, they will put a lot of resources into a company that is bigger, more well-known, but isn't necessarily producing the best product. And that can be a disadvantage to smaller companies, other companies who have a better service, a better product, but obviously are not going to come into the advantages of all its government funding or government support. So we always have to be careful about what we wish for there. So that's very clear that there will be a lot more of new green economy. There will be a strong push, and I think we mentioned this in our last webinar, to have a single payer healthcare or health insurance system. And of course, the single payer will be a public organization, will be the state. And once again, the government does not have a good history or a strong history of doing things efficiently. And if we have a lot of involvement of the US federal government and the state governments in health insurance, in healthcare. As I mentioned last time, everybody who's over 65 in the United States is already covered by a single payer government system. And there are a lot of holes, a lot of gaps in providing the services. And there's no doubt that that single payer system makes the health care much more expensive, because the individual person, and Europeans have a lot of experience with this also, when you go to get health care, you don't know what the cost is. You don't care what the cost is. Somebody else is going to take care of it. And it's usually the state who's going to take care of it. And whoever provides the service, in the back of their minds, are thinking, well, I will bill the state for this. And as long as I'm in their guidelines, I can charge much more than really we would have needed to charge. So totally getting away from free market principles in any industry does not lead to a better result, and it always leads to a more expensive result. I think that there's going to be a strong tendency for that under the Biden administration. And one more thing that I'd like to mention that is important for our audience, that I don't think a lot of media outlets are emphasizing. Biden has named much of his foreign policy team, and the experience, the history of Biden in foreign policy, in my opinion, has not been a very good one. It's not been very helpful for the United States. So if he's bringing in, which he is, lots of people that he worked with in the Obama administration, even people from the first Clinton administration back in the 1990s, they've had a very unfortunate, in many ways, track record of multilateralism and interventionalism. That is, they believe everywhere in the world, and this, I know this because that's the way they've acted always. They believe that the United States should look around at the various nations in the world, and if there's a particular government that the United States doesn't think is a good government or not in the interests of the United States, they will do a lot. They will undertake a lot to try to undermine that government up until the use of military force. And just like the Clintons, Biden is on record. And once again, don't listen to what they say. Look at what they actually do. Look at what they've done. He supported every foreign military intervention that the United States has had since the early 1970s when he became a senator. And as everybody, I think, would agree, we have not had very good results for those military inventions in the countries in which they took place. And it certainly didn't help the standing or the position or the interests of the United States. So I think there's a very great danger that lots of mistakes will continue to be made because he's bringing in people who were behind the original mistakes, and he himself also was. That's something that everybody needs to challenge the Biden administration on. And obviously, up until now, nobody's really been challenging them. They're all acting as if they're happy that he was elected and he's coming to Washington. And we have to, once again, be careful for what we wish for.
So, Steve, we have just 2 minutes left. So we need to be positive. We are always, but we need to conclude with the positive thoughts. So nothing basically crucial will change for the European companies that are doing business in the US. Would you agree with that? The US remains the free market economy. You need to follow the regulations. You need to see what kind of regulations are in the certain state. But basically nothing crucial will change also for Slovenian companies.
I would agree with that statement. The advantages of the United States that almost no country has, the one large domestic market, the strong tradition and structure of free market principles, the very good culture for entrepreneurship, and these strong, established, very large private capital and financial markets are the four greatest strengths of the United States, and the democratic tradition of the United States is also a great is a very important advantage, which has maintained itself, which has stood up to these obstacles. Those five great advantages of the United States are as strong and as valid as they ever were. And just like it takes a lot more than 1,000 rioters to stop the process of the US government, it would take a lot more than any one single president's administration to negatively impact in the long run the United States. I have to remind everybody, 4 years ago, so many people, almost everybody in the media, so many people were saying when Trump was elected, the country is going to be ruined, I'm leaving, it's not worth investing here. That obviously did not turn out to be the case, and that will not be the case in the present administration. One last quote that I will leave us here, and then once again, I welcome the audience to provide us their questions, which we can answer in other means off of this webinar. And this has been said by numerous people, but it's often attributed to the great investor Warren Buffett. He said, "It's always a bad investment to bet against the United States." And I think that has always been true, and it will always be true. Even though we have all of these challenges, I think it's still a good country, a good society, and well worth investing in, and people are investing in it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this inspiring and also positive words for the end, Steve. And of course, I hope we'll see you also in person this year in Slovenia. We did record this conversation today, so we'll place it on YouTube and on our social media. And Steve, thank you so much. Do enjoy the weekend. We have very sunny here in Slovenia, although very cold. So I would like to thank also to all AmCham Patron members. Enjoy the weekend and stay healthy and safe. Hvala, Steve.
Hvala, nasvidenje.
Bye-bye.